Okay, so now we're on to the final major app of the course. Congratulations on making it this far, and let's take a quick moment to think about how much you've covered. You've now made 3 full-blown apps, that is Instagram, Tinder, and the Flappy Bird game, as well as covering a huge amount from the Swift and Xcode API. You've worked with images, you've worked with sound, you've worked with tables, you've worked with all sorts of different kind of inputs and outputs. So now you really should be in the position to be able to make your own apps. Obviously, we haven't covered absolutely everything, and I'm going to be adding to the course as time goes on in the final section to show you how to do extra little things like create custom keyboards. But really, you've got the core understanding now. So you should find that even if there's something that you want to do that hasn't been covered in the course, it's pretty easy for you to go out there and look on Stack Overflow or Google or wherever it might be and find out how to do it. So, in fact, that is my advice for this chapter. I'm really suggesting that you don't watch the videos for this particular chapter. You'll be much better off if you go away and use the skills that you've already covered to work out how to make the app yourself. So I strongly recommend you do that. Nonetheless, I will go through the process and you're welcome to watch if you want to. Now, Snapchat, if you haven't seen it, is an app with a very simple premise. It's now reasonably complicated as an app, but initially it was very simple. You could select a user and you could send them a photo, which you get from your camera or from your camera roll. And then you send the user that photo, it appears on their screen for a certain number of seconds and then is supposedly immediately destroyed. And that's the version we're going to make here. So, the functionality that you need some kind of sign in, and you can choose the Facebook sign in or manual username and password or whatever you want. You could even try and do a Google Plus or a Twitter sign in using the past documentation if you're feeling fancy. And then all you want to do is display a list of the users, and then when the user taps on a particular user, they can send that user a photo. And then when the user receives a photo, it appears on their screen for a certain number of seconds. The user's not allowed to interact with it in any way. And then once it's gone, it's gone. And we go back to the user table. That's it. That's the functionality of the app. So I'm going to pause now for you to pause the video and go away and try and make this completely on your own. And I wish you the best of luck. I hope you manage to do it. Okay, I hope that went well. I'm now going to lead you through the process that I would take to set up this app. Now, the basis that we've got here, you'll notice it says Tinder everywhere. We can live with that. It's essentially an early version of the Tinder app, which has nothing on the main storyboard. The view controller is just the default. But we do have all of the paths set up in here. I've removed the Facebook line. I'm not going to go for Facebook login here because I've already shown you how to do that. The first thing that we're going to need to do is create a new application because we don't want to confuse our new users with those of our previous apps. So we're going to go over to pass.com and I'm going to click here and go down to dashboard, which will allow me to add a new app. There we go. So create new app. And we'll call this Snapchat, create app. There we go. So the main thing I want is application ID. There we go. And let's copy over the client key as well. Great, that's all I need from Pass for the moment. So we'll just go over to the data browser, which will of course not show anything at the moment. And now let's go back over to Xcode. Right, so I'm going to create an extremely lazy sign-in process here. All the user is going to enter is their username. And then if that username exists, it's going to log them in. And if it doesn't, it's going to sign them up. Simple as that. Obviously, for most apps, that's not a particularly good way of logging in, especially if you're showing the username publicly somehow, but it will do for now, and it will show you yet another way that you can have a nice, easy login for your apps. So let's start with a couple of labels. This is going to be our main view controller. Again, I'm really not thinking about design or layout or anything fancy at all. I'm just setting up a fairly clean interface. There we go, just center that. Great. Then we'll have another label. Enter a username. Again, we'll center that. Then we'll have a text field for the user to enter their name into. And finally, we'll have a button. Which will just say sign in. Okay, so that will do for our front page. I'm not even going to worry about the constraints and all of this because we've done it many times before. I don't need to show you how to do it again. If you're not sure about centering or displaying your labels correctly in a number of orientations, then go back and look at where we've looked at that in previous chapters. So now I'm going to click the assistant editor so that we can have the main storyboard and our viewcontroller.swift file up at the same time. The only items here I'm particularly interested in are the username. So we'll just call that username. And the sign in button. We'll call that sign in, and we want an action that happens when we click sign in. Okay, now let's go back, close the things we don't need. Great. So what do we want to do when the user tries to sign in? Well, first of all, we want to try and log them in. That's what we're going to do first. And if we fail to log them in, then we're going to sign them up. That's the plan. So we're going to jump over to the pass documentation. We're not going to code from scratch because I suspect you probably don't know all of the functions, or at least generally speaking, it's quicker not to if you're using something from the pass documentation. So we're just doing something very straightforward here. So I'm going to go straight to the iOS pass documentation. So I just search for iOS docs there. And we want to be working with users. So once that's loaded, we'll click on users. There we go. And we want to start by logging in a user. So here we go. Let's go over to Swift. And that's what we want. So as soon as we press the button, we're going to try and log them in. So we want to change the username to the username they've entered. So that's username.text. And the password, we're not actually allowing them to enter a password, but pass does require a password. So we're just going to have my pass being the default password for each user. Okay. So if there's a problem, for now, we'll just print that to the logs. If there isn't, then we have a user. So we're going to redirect them to the user table, but we don't have that yet. So we'll come back and fill that in when we have a segue to the user table. So really here, we want to try and sign them up, because the most likely option, if we're trying to log them in and it doesn't work, the most likely option is that the user doesn't exist or the username isn't there. So let's do a sign up. We can do that using, again, the pass documentation. So we don't want to do it as a particular function. We just want the main code there. So let's just copy our final error. So that's where we're actually going to display our error. And we don't want the email or the phone number. All we want to do is change the username to username.text. And we're inside a closure here, so we're going to need self. And of course we do need to make sure all their passwords are the same, so that would be mypass. Okay. Let's just add signed up there. Great, so we should find that we try and log them in. If it's successful, then nothing will happen at the moment. In fact, let's just add a quick logged in just so that we can see that. If it's not successful, it will attempt to sign them up. And if that's not successful, then we'll get an error. So the handy thing about this setup is that not only can we just test that it's working, but we can add lots of users at once without the redirector happening. So it's handy for us to be able to add all of our users in one go so that we can test the app out and make sure it works with different users. But let's just test this out. So Rob, sign in. Okay, we've got an invalid login credentials because we attempted to log in Rob, and that obviously didn't work because Rob doesn't exist, but it does say signed up there. So that sounds promising. Let's just refresh the Pass data browser, and we should now find that Rob is there. Fantastic. And in fact, if I now sign in again with Rob, we should just get the logged in. Brilliant. So let's add a few people to our app. Kirsten, Tom, and Ralphie. Fantastic. So we've got 4 people in our app, and all of the login stuff seems to be working fine. So let's jump over to main storyboard and create a new view controller for our user table. So we'll make a table view controller, pop it there. Oops, change the size as always. There we go. And we need to be able to control this table view controller. So the first thing I'll do is create a new file, which will be a Cocoa Touch class. And we've got all the details in there. I'm going to change that to user view controller just to make it slightly clearer. You'll need to have UI table view controller in there, and obviously Swift as the language. We'll save that same place as everywhere else. So there it is, user view controller.swift. You can see we've got our table views there. The default currently gives you a warning here, the default code. So I would suggest just removing the exclamation mark as recommended. That may change slightly in future versions of Xcode. Okay, so back to main storyboard, and then we want to select our new user view controller. So now we can control this table view with the user view controller.swift file. But we're not quite done with our initial view controller yet. So let's control drag from the view controller to our new view controller and create a new manual segue. And then we'll click on the segue. And we'll call it show users. Okay. So now that we've got our segue, we can go back to our view controller, and when the user is logged in, we can then segue. Do you remember how to do that? It's self.perform segue with identifier. The identifier is what we just used, so show users, and the sender is self. So we'll copy that down to there as well. And the last thing we want to do is make the app go straight to the user screen if the user is already logged in. Now here, if we try and put this bit of code in viewDidLoad and perform the segue, we're likely to have problems because viewDidLoad doesn't mean that the view has actually displayed. It just means that the core elements have been created. So if you try and segue inside viewDidLoad, it's likely not to happen. So what we can do to get over that is use the viewDidAppear method instead. Oh, in fact, I don't need to type that again. So viewDidAppear means the view has actually loaded. So let's now test to see that if we've got a user. Remember how to do that. pfuser.currentUser is not nil. So if that is the case, we want to perform our segue. So let's now run that. We should find that because the user is logged in, hopefully as Ralphie, because he was the last person that we signed up as, it then goes straight to our table. Fantastic. So that's the behavior we want. Let's go back to our table and just set this up. We want to do a couple of things. I want to put a navigation bar at the top. So let's drag in our navigation bar. As long as we get it in the right place, we can just add it on there. And that's great. And we'll put the title something like Snapchat users. Great. So that's how we want our main page to look. Now we've just got to get our users. So let's go to user view controller.swift. And in the viewDidLoad method, this is where we're going to get our list of users. So let's go back over to parse and see how we do that. We have, of course, seen this before, but if you've got the chance to just copy and paste the code, take it. Okay, so there's our query. Remember, pfuser.query. Now, we do want one key here because we don't want to return the user themselves because they don't want to be sending themselves messages. So let's change that to where key. And then when we get our predictions, I think I have to type it from scratch. That's the one I want. So I want where the key is not equal to something. And the key is username. And the thing that we want it not to be equal to is the current user's username. Is the current user's username. So we get that by doing pfuser.currentUser.username. So that will return all the users except the current one. So let's change that to users. And then we're going to want to loop through those users. So let's go back up to queries and basic queries. So here, there's our little bit of code. Quite easy to write, but again, you can be sure you're going to get it right if you go directly to parse. So obviously we're not using objects, we're using users. So let's do it for user in users. And then I think I did actually copy the Objective-C. Oh no, it was the Swift code. Oh well. So for now, let's just display the username. And that should just make sure that we're doing this right and we're getting 4 users returned. Oh, actually it'll be 3 because it'll be everyone except for the current user. So there we go, Kirsten, Rob and Tom. Fantastic. Notice we're getting this message here. We don't need to worry too much about that. What's going on is there are 2 possible methods we could use to get the objects, either find objects or find objects in background with block. And the latter of those 2 will give you a block of code, and then we could put this in that block. That would be fine. What this does is it just waits until the find objects method has completed before completing anything down here. So this is what's known as a synchronous call as opposed to an asynchronous call. So if we had a lot of code down here that we wanted to run when this was going on, then we would want to use the find objects in background with block code. But we don't. The only thing that we want to do is update the table, and that we're not going to do until this is completed anyway. So I wouldn't worry about this bit of code there. But if you want to get rid of that warning, then just use find objects in background with block instead. But the good news is we're returning the 3 users that we want. So let's save them in our table. I think the easiest way to do that will be to create an array. Let's call it user array. And that's going to be just an array of strings. And initially it will be empty. So we'll set it like that. And then instead of displaying the username like that, what we'll do is we'll append it to the array. So user array dot append, and the new element is going to be user dot username. Great. So let's now go over here and sort our table. So number of sections in table is going to be 1. Number of rows in section is going to be the length of our array. So let's return user array dot count. And you'll remember self-arrow at index path is where we define each individual cell. Now the default code has several exclamation marks in it. I find that you have to remove all of those to get rid of the error there, just like we did with the other methods up there. So all we're going to do here, very simple, is set the cell text to the username of the user. So we do that with cell.text label.text, and it will handily put in the exclamation mark for us, the question mark for us there. And that's going to be user array. And we want the current row. So that's going to be index path dot row. And we'll just set that to the reuse identifier, we'll set to cell, and then we'll check. I don't think I set that earlier. So let's just bring that in now. So we've got the cell there, and we'll set the reuse identifier to cell. Fantastic. So let's now run that, and we should find that we have a table of users that includes all of the users except the current user, which is what we want. Obviously, we haven't ordered those users in any way. There they are, fantastic. If you want to put them in alphabetical order or something like that, then obviously you can do that using the query. I'll leave you to go and look at the past documentation if you want to do that. But that takes us to the end of this video. In the next video, we're going to look at actually sending the users a message when you tap on them. I'll see you there.